Welcome back everyone. Today we're gonna be making a tote backpack. The finished bag measures in at 15 by 12.5 with a 5-inch depth, making it an all-around great size for daily use. And the cool thing is, you can either use this as a full-blown backpack or stow away the straps and use it as a tote. And this project is on the easier side, so if you're new to sewing, you should have no problem. And with all that being said, if you're new to the channel, grab that printable pattern and let's get started. Getting started with supplies, you're going to want to grab 1.5 yards for your main fabric, and I recommend grabbing a canvas, denim, or twill. These are all very durable fabrics that are easy to work with. I'm also going to be using a few different fabrics. I'm going to be using a nylon fabric that's used in a lot of hiking bags, an upholstery fabric, and also a twill. But realistically, you can use any fabric you like. You'll need 1.5 yards for your secondary fabric, and this is gonna be your lining. So I recommend using a lighter weight cotton or polyester. We're gonna be adding a lot of layers together throughout this project, so a lighter weight fabric will reduce a lot of bulk. You'll need a 1/4 yard of vinyl or leather, and this is gonna be for flaps and guards. This is totally optional. You can always use the main fabric, but we'll get into this more later on. You'll need 2 16-inch or more zippers. I'm actually gonna be using a zipper roll, so I'm cutting my own zippers at preferred lengths, but you can use plastic, metal, pretty much any type of zipper will work great for this project. You'll need 1 to 2 yards of 1-inch webbing and 2 yards of 1.5-inch webbing. The 1.5-inch webbing is gonna be used on the straps, and I'm actually gonna be going in how to make handles with that. So I'm using a little bit less than 2 yards, but I highly recommend grabbing 2 yards of 1.5-inch webbing to start. Going along with the 1-inch webbing, you're gonna wanna grab 2 lobster clasps, 2 D-rings, and 2 strap adjusters. You want all this hardware to match the width of your 1-inch webbing. You'll need a 1/4 yard of a 1/4 inch up to a 1/2-inch foam, and this is gonna be used on the straps. You'll need 2 snap buttons. You can use magnetic or regular. I'm using magnetic snap buttons. They're super easy to install and look really nice. Lastly, you'll need your pattern. This pattern is available at properfitclothing.com. It's super easy to use. All you have to do is print it off, tape it together, and you're ready to go. And before you get started, it's best to cut off the top and one of the side edges. This is gonna allow you to overlap the pages for a perfectly aligned pattern. And once you have all your supplies gathered and your pattern taped together, it's time to move into cutting.
After taping your pattern together, it should look like this, and for the best results, make sure your printer is aligned. Cut out all the pieces on the outside of the black line, and you should end up with 2 bottom guard side panels, cut out of your main fabric or vinyl, 1 pocket flap panel cut on the fold out of your main fabric or vinyl, 2 bottom guard front back panels cut out of your main fabric or your vinyl, 2 bottom side strap panels cut out of your main fabric, 4 top opening side panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your lining, 4 main strap panels cut out of your main fabric, 2 side pocket panels, both cut out of your main fabric, 2 top pocket panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your lining, 4 top opening main panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your lining, 1 main back top panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 main front top panel cut out of your main fabric, 4 side panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your lining, 2 main bottom panels, 1 cut out of your main fabric and 1 cut out of your lining, 4 front back pocket panels, 2 cut out of your main fabric and 2 cut out of your lining, 1 main front bottom panel cut out of your main fabric, 1 main back bottom panel cut out of your main fabric, and lastly 2 main front back lining panels, both cut out of your lining. Moving on to construction, grab both of your top pocket panels, place the right sides together, and stitch the top edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the wrong sides of the panel together, lining up the top edge, place a few pins, making sure both sides are even, and we're going to add a top stitch. And I'm using an edge presser foot. This is super helpful to get a nice even stitch. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the guides on both sides, and this is where we're going to fold over the edges on both sides, pin it down, make sure both sides are even, and from here we're going to grab our front back pocket panels. We'll need just one of the main fabric panels to start. Using the guides on the pattern, we're going to mark out the guard placement and the pocket placement. The easiest way to do this is to poke holes in the corners, chalk the corners, and lastly connect your markings with a ruler. This will give you nice even guides to work with. After marking the guides, place the pocket within the pocket guides. Make sure the pocket is centered and that it's lined up directly on the guard marking. And when you're satisfied with the placement, we're going to stitch both of the side edges and do a nice tack stitch at the top of the pocket. grab your bottom guard front back panel. We'll just be using one to start, and I'm going to be using a vinyl. You can use a vinyl or whatever you're using for your main fabric. From here, we're going to place it directly on our guard marking and flip it over the horizontal axes. With the right sides together, make sure the edge lines up directly on your marking and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, flip the panel flat, lining both of the bottom edges up, add a few pins, and we're going to add a top stitch to that top edge. Be sure to take your time and make it as neat as possible. Grab the remainder of your front back pocket panels, lay the main fabric panels out facing right side up, and place your lining panels with right sides together. Line up both of the top edges and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, keeping both of the stitches as even as possible. Flip the wrong sides together, and just like we did the pocket panel, we're going to line up the top edges, add a few pins to make sure everything is even, and then add our top stitch. And another good tip for nice clean top stitches is using the same color thread that matches your fabric. And after completing the stitch for both of the panels, you can place these off to the side. Grab your 1.5 inch webbing, and I'm going to show you how to make a leather handle. I'm going to start by folding my webbing in half, cutting it, folding in half one more time, cutting it so I have 4 even strips. From here, I'm going to cut 2 6-inch leather or vinyl strips that match the width of my webbing, place the right sides together with one webbing strip, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. With the webbing connected to the leather, we're going to flip it open and add a top stitch. This will overall add strength to your handle. With our top stitch in position, we're going to do the exact same thing to the opposite side. Grab another strip, put the right sides together, stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and add your top stitch. With both of your handles complete, we're going to grab the leather section, fold it together with the wrong sides touching, and add a stitch on that bottom edge as close as you can to that edge. If you're using a nylon-based webbing, the best thing to do is use a lighter to clean up all of the edges. This will seal and prevent fraying. And that's a super quick way to add a handle at the top of your strap. It's totally optional, and you can do this without the leather strip. You can just fold a part of your strap webbing, stitch it on the side, and you're good to go. Moving on, grab your main front top panel. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the webbing placement guides. Grab your 2 to 2.5 foot strap, which is your 1.5 foot width webbing. Line the strap ends up on the markings. Grab your 14-inch zipper, and we're going to line it up on the bottom edge with right sides together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the zipper flat, and we're going to add a top stitch to the inside of the zipper. So you're going to want the zipper to fold over and the seam allowance to go under the zipper. After adding the top stitch, next we're going to add stitches to both of our straps. I'm going to use a box technique and stitch on the outside edges, but make sure you don't stitch all the way to the top of the panel. You need at least a 1/2 inch at the top to make it easier to attach the top opening panel later on. Next, grab your pocket flat panel, flip the panel open on the fold, and then we're going to fold it the opposite way with right sides together. Stitch both of the side edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. After stitching, we're going to flip the right sides back out, poking out both of those corners. With both sides even as possible, we're going to add a top stitch all the way around the outside edges, leaving that top edge open. I highly recommend taking your time and making this one as neat as possible because it's going to be front and center of your bag. From here, we're going to use the pattern to mark out the placement of our buttons. After marking, cut or punch out your holes. And I'm using a magnetic snap. The side I'd like to start with is the thinner side for the top flat panel. Slide both the snaps into your holes from the bottom of your flat panel. Flip the panel right side up and grab the back end of your snaps. Secure the snaps onto the back of the magnets. And once everything is lined up, you can either press, use pliers, or even a hammer die to fully tighten and secure these closures down. And it's really that simple to add these magnetic snaps to your bag. Grab your main front bottom panel, place your completed flat panel on the top edge directly in the center, and we're going to place the opposite edge of our zipper on the top edge of our panel, sandwiching the flap in between both of the layers. Pin all the layers together and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Flip the top panel flat, and we're going to do the same thing we did for the opposite side of the zipper. We're going to add a top stitch to that zipper directly on top of that zipper. And this is going to be our complete new main fabric front panel. Grab your main front back lining panels. Starting with one, place the right sides down, and grab our complete front panel, place it on top with wrong sides together. Place the front pocket panel on top, lining up the bottom and side edges. And we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge as close as we can to that edge. I'm using a serger. This takes care of a lot of fraying and makes it overall easier to connect the panels in the end. Since I am using a serger, I'm skipping past the zippers, but if you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch or just a regular straight stitch. After stitching, we can finish off our closures, so the best way to do this is line up where exactly the top of the closure falls and mark it out with chalk. After finding the marking, snip or punch out your holes. Feed the opposite side of your closure through your holes. Add the backings to the closure, and lastly, press your closure into position. After adding the opposite side, I always like to test it out to make sure everything lines up. If you're satisfied and everything lines up, you can place this front panel off to the side, and grab your main strap panels. Line up the straps with the right sides together, creating 2 separate straps. Stitch around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, leaving the top edge open. And definitely take your time going around the curves because you want that to be as even as possible for a nice looking strap. And for the best results, I recommend practicing sewing curves. After stitching, we're going to add our foam inserts, and these are going to be cut smaller than the actual stitch itself. You want these inserts to be on the inside of your stitch. You can use a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch foam. So what I do is sew the foam insert to the seam allowance on the front tip. This is going to keep that foam into position while you're pulling the right sides out. From here, we're going to start at the inside and push everything out towards the outside, eventually working the bottom of that strap to the top opening. Once you have the bottom to the opening, you can grab it and pull the rest out very easily. And if you have foam sticking out the end, it's totally fine. I like to cut mine longer, and then I roll back the top about 2 inches and snip the foam. After stitching, roll the panel back flat, and you should have about a 2-inch gap between the top edge and your foam. To secure everything into place, we're going to serge the top edge. You can serge or just use a regular straight stitch. Next, we're going to add a stitch directly down the center of our straps. This is going to push the foam off to the side, overall giving the strap a fuller effect. And it's also going to keep that foam insert on the inside from moving around. And totally feel free to customize the length or the width. Grab your webbing, and we're using a 1-inch webbing. Cut 2 6-inch strips. You'll need both of your strap adjusters. We're going to slide the strips of webbing in the top opening of your strap adjuster, and then we're going to roll over the back, making a nice clean edge. Grab your pattern piece, cut out your webbing placement, and we're going to place it directly on the strap at the bottom, lining it up in the center. Place your webbing and strap adjuster on your marking, making sure both sides are even and they line up even on top and bottom. From here, we're going to add a box stitch just like we did our straps. Stitch around the outside edges, but don't go all the way down to the bottom where the strap adjuster is. Stop about a 1/2 inch from the strap adjuster and continue back around. Again, feel free to add X or more stitches to add more strength to the strap. Finishing off the straps, we're going to cut 2 2-foot strips of webbing. Grab our lobster clasp, and you can either use plastic or metal. Just make sure the openings match the width of your webbing. Feed the webbing through the opening, and we're going to roll the end over just like we did in the previous step to hide the raw edge of the webbing. When you have the end folded, add a nice tack stitch. These ends will take a lot of stress, so definitely make sure you tack stitch it down good. And to complete our straps, we're going to take our bottom strap, feed it through our strap adjuster from the outside opening, back down through the inside opening. Just like the previous step, we're going to roll that webbing end over twice and add a tack stitch. This will also prevent the strap from sliding back out the strap adjuster. And just like that, your straps are complete. Feel free to adjust the size of the straps. This is easily done by adding more or less webbing. Moving on, grab both of our bottom side strap panels, place the right sides up, and be sure to mark the hem fold on both panels. Cut 2 6-inch webbing strips, fold both of the back side panels at the hem guide. Pin the hem into position. Grab your 2 1-inch D-rings. Feed your webbing strips evenly through the D-rings. Place the webbing strip on the inside of our folded strap panel, leaving about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of webbing sticking out of the strap panel. Pin all the layers together and stitch the outside edge. Make sure you're stitching the webbing on that bottom edge. You really want to secure that webbing into position, so feel free to add a couple more diagonal stitches going across that webbing. I added 2 extra to really secure it down, and then snip the webbing flush with the side of the panel. And repeat this process for the other strap panel. Grab your main back top panel, mark out both of our webbing placements. Grab the opposite 1.5-inch strap, place the strap on your marked out guides, and we're going to add a box stitch just like we did the other strap. And it's best to check the placement of the other strap so that way both of these straps are lined up when you're done stitching on the strap. Feel free to add a couple more extra stitches and grab our main back bottom panel. With the right sides facing up, grab our strap panels, and we're going to line the strap panels up with our top strap panels on the outside edge. Flip the top panel down with the right sides together, lining up the top edge, and we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sandwiching the straps in between the panels. Flip the panels open, flattening out the seam, fold the seam allowance towards that top edge, and add a top stitch on that top panel. And depending on what type of strap you're using, this can get a little bit tricky in those areas. After top stitching, grab the opposite front back pocket panel, mark out the guard placement on your main fabric, grab the opposite bottom guard front back panel, and we're going to install it the same way. Flip it over the marked out guide and stitch it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the panel flat, lining up the bottom edges, and add a top stitch. And I'm stitching through both of the layers, the main fabric and the lining. After top stitching, we're going to place the pocket panel on the back panel, lining up the bottom edges. Grab the opposite main front back lining panel, place the right sides down, slide your back panel on top with wrong sides together, and stitch around the outside edge as close as you can to that edge. Again, I'm using a serger. You can use a serger, a zigzag stitch, or a straight stitch as close as you can to the outside edge. But ultimately, use whatever method that works best for you. And after stitching, make sure all your layers are connected. Grab your completed bottom side strap panels, and we're going to place them directly on the side edges, lining the points up with our guard panel. When you have them evenly lined up with one another, you can either serge them or stitch them on. After attaching the panels, I like to connect the straps and actually try it on to make sure it fits correctly. From here, you can actually make adjustments to the webbing to resize it if you need to. Place the straps on the inside of the pocket and move the panel off to the side. Grab your side pocket panels. Using the pattern, we're going to mark out the hem guides on both of the panels and fold at both of the markings, leaving a nice clean edge. Pin the hems into position and add a top stitch. For this one, I'm going to add a stitch on top and also a stitch on the bottom edge of that hem. Repeat this for the opposite pocket panel and just make sure that both of these stitches are even as possible. Grab the bottom guard side panel. Place them on the bottom edge of your pocket panel, slide them down about a 1/4 inch and flip them over the horizontal axes. Pin the panels into position and sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And this is the same concept as the front. You want them to line up with the bottom edge when you flip them back flat. After flipping the panels flat and adding a few pins, add the top stitch to both of your panels. And you really want to make sure you have them even with the front and back panel. Grab your side panels and we'll be starting with the main fabric. With the right sides up, grab your pocket panels and place your pocket panels on the bottom edge. As you can see, the pockets are tapered from top to bottom, making them wider on the top. So what we're going to do is line up both of the side edges and pin those into position. This is going to pop out the center of that pocket, giving us a little bit more room in that pocket. And from here, we're going to stitch the outside edges as close as we can to the edge. Again, we just want to lock these into position to make it easier in future steps. With the pockets secured to the side panels, grab your lining panel, place the wrong sides together, and we're going to lock the layers together by stitching all the way around the outside edge as close as we can to that edge. And just like the previous steps, I'm using a serger, but feel free to use whatever method you want. After securing the layers together, just double check to make sure all the layers are connected. Move the panels off to the side and grab your main bottom panels. Place the wrong sides together and we're going to stitch all the way around the outside edge, connecting these panels together. After serging or stitching, just do a double quick check, make sure the layers are all connected together, and grab your top opening main panels. Starting with one main fabric panel, grab your 16-inch zipper, place the right sides together on the top edge. Place the lining panel with right sides together on the opposite side of the zipper, lining up the edges for the main fabric and the lining, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Open up the panels with the wrong sides together, add a few pins, and we're going to do the same thing for the opposite side. Sandwich the main fabric and lining in between the zipper, making sure that both the edges are lined up from one another across the zipper, and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Fold the wrong sides together, add a few pins, and we're going to add a top stitch to both of those side seams. And try to make these ones as neat as possible. They're going to be at the top of your bag. From here, we're going to grab our top opening side panel, place the right sides together, lining up the side edges. Do the same for the lining on the opposite side. And we're going to stitch these side edges at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sandwiching that main top panel layer in between the side panels. Flip the wrong side of the side panels together, making sure the outside edges line up, and add a top stitch. Just be careful going over the zipper. You may want to hand crank it because it can get pretty thick. Repeat this process for the opposite side, and the last step for this panel is adding a serge all the way around the outside edge, and you can either add a serge, straight stitch, or a zigzag stitch. And finally, this is the last panel before we start connecting everything together. Place it off to the side, grab our front and side panels. Be sure to move the zipper train to the inside of the panel, and we're going to place our side panels directly on the side of our main panels with right sides together. With the side panels perfectly lined up, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, on both of the edges. And just go slow, this can get bulky, definitely going over that zipper, so take your time, hand crank it if you need to. And definitely after stitching, open up the panels, make sure all the layers got stitched together. And from here, we're gonna grab our back panel and do the same thing. Place the right sides together on the opposite side of the side panel, pin the layers together, and then we're gonna slide it over to the opposite side panel and pin both of the sides together on that side panel. And just like the previous step, when you're satisfied and everything is lined up, go ahead and stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance on both of those side seams. Take your time going over the bulkier areas. When you're complete, flip the right sides out. Double check to make sure all the layers got sewn together. And if it's looking good, we're gonna flip the wrong sides back out and snip the zipper ends on both sides of the bag flush with the seam allowance. The next step, we're going to add bias tape to the inside edges, and this step is optional, but I'm going to walk you through a few different methods to make it easy. The first method is using a bias tape making kit, and this is where you make your own bias tape. It's super simple to do. You cut your bias tape strips, feed it through your folder, and press it as it's coming out your folder. And by picking this method, you get to choose the size and also the color of fabric to match your project. The second method is using a double fold bias tape binder. You install this to your machine and it gives you the ability to sew directly onto your garment. It's a very fast and effective technique. The third technique is using pre-made bias tape. This technique, you're very limited to colors, but it's easy to do. You just fold it over your edge and stitch it down. This is a great way to go if you don't have a lot of tools to work with. And I'm going to be stitching mine on using the double fold bias tape attachment. By far, this is one of the best techniques if you're planning on making a lot of bags, but feel free to use whatever method that works best for you. If you did serge the panels, you don't technically need to do this. I like to do this for more strength and support. Moving on, grab your main bottom panel, the one you stitched together, and we're going to open up that bottom opening, place the right sides together, directly in the center, pin the layers together. And when you have that panel lined up with the outside edges of your main panel, we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the outside edge. I'm stitching with that top panel pointing down. This is a lot easier technique than trying to stitch with it pointing up, but feel free to use whatever technique that works best for you. Just take your time going around those corners. Since this was a trickier stitch, you're going to want to flip the right sides back out to make sure that all the layers got stitched together and that the corners pop out nicely. And then from here, we're going to grab the top panel, and we're going to do the same exact thing for the top opening, lining up the panel directly in the center of that opening. When you have it lined up and centered, pin it into position and stitch around the outside edge at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And the top is a little bit easier than the bottom because we rounded off the sides, so we're not doing direct corners like the bottom. But for the best results, just take your time, go slow, and make sure all the layers are getting pulled evenly. And after completing the stitch, we're going to flip the right sides out just to double check the work to make sure all the layers got stitched together nice. And if you're satisfied, we're going to add the bias tape to both of those new edges on the inside of our bag. After bias taping those edges, we're going to add a top stitch to the top opening panel. Just like previous steps, make sure the layers are evenly together and top stitch all the way around the entire opening. And it can get pretty bulky, so just definitely take your time and try to make it as neat as possible. And this stitch is really going to help define that top edge opening, overall giving you a nicer, more professional looking bag. And finally, the last few steps, we're going to add zipper pulls and our branding. I like to use simple branded leather tags that are attached with grommets, and I attach them in areas that I can clip things to.
And there you have it, your tote backpack is complete. Thank you so much for watching. If yours didn't turn out good the first try, that's totally fine. You just have to practice, practice, practice. It will make all your projects look better. And the more you make these projects, honestly, that's a ton of practice and you're gonna get better with each project. Like always, if you have any questions, definitely send them my way. Or if you wanna see me make something. But until next time, I'm gonna keep the videos coming at you, so I'll see you next time.